Okay, well, let's get into the issue right now. Susan Smith is a Liberal strategist, principal and co-founder of the Blue Sky Strategy Group, and also in today, Conservative strategist Cole Hogan. Hello to the two of you.
Hello.
Hello, Michael.
So listen, I want to break this up a little bit and begin with the assertion being made by the Conservative leader, this idea that, Mark Carney returns back to Ottawa empty-handed, although, to be fair, officials were essentially cautioning the media, don't expect a deal out of this visit. So how fair is that criticism, Cole?
Yeah, I think the criticism is pretty well founded and justified for the Conservatives. And I got to say, just in general, on Mark Carney's meeting with Donald Trump at the White House, it's always nice to see former running mates get back together after an election. But in all seriousness, I think that there's a reason why. Like, Donald Trump specified that he wanted Mark Carney as Prime Minister of Canada. He said that he would prefer to deal with him. Now we're seeing what that looks like and what the reason for him saying that was. Conservatives are merely holding Mark Carney and the Liberals to the promises they've continuously made. So, Mark Carney said he'd get a deal by July 21st. That didn't happen. He said he would only relax counter tariffs when the Americans began to respect us. He dropped counter tariffs anyway. He said that, he would negotiate a deal with Donald Trump and that he could handle him. And then now he greets him by saying, hey, look, I wore a red tie for you. So I don't think that he should go in there guns a-blazing, of course, but we have to know how quickly, how fast we went from elbows up to kowtowing to Donald Trump's whims.
Mm-hmm. But is it fair, though, to take him on when even the PMO is expecting a deal out of Washington, though? At least not this time around.
Well, look, I think that, we can only react to the expectations that have been set by this government and the Liberal Party generally. Like, this was supposed to be the rainmaker and the person that was elected to do this exact job. So this is, if this is the metric you're going to get elected on, this is the metric you will be judged by the Canadian electorate and generally politically.
Okay, so Susan, then does the government have a communication challenge here? Because at the end of the day, when Pierre Poilievre says in the House of Commons, Mark Carney just came back home with no deal, all Pierre Poilievre is doing is stating the truth.
Well, I'd like to back up a little bit. I basically disagree with most of Cole's characterizations there. And I think the main point is that successful negotiations don't take place in public. Everybody knows, whether Mr. Poilievre wants to acknowledge it or not, that negotiating with Mr. Trump and the Americans is a mercurial exercise at this point in time. And even the Brits and the EU, who sort of scurried and hurried up to get a deal, are regretting that. And the math that's been done after the fact is seeing that it wasn't quite such a good exercise that they've got. So I think the patience that the Canadians are showing is actually the right thing to do. The other thing is the U.S. Supreme Court's going to rule November 5th about whether these tariffs are in fact valid, and that could be a complete game changer too. So the Canadians are, I think, exhibiting tactics and patience to get the right deal, and that's what Mr. Carney is doing. Mr. Poilievre continues to look for sound bites and to absolutely simplify things, even if he actually gets simplify things and play fast and loose with the facts. But the Canadian negotiators are working behind the scenes. Everybody knows that's the best way to get a deal done. And, Trump, no one has said he's predictable. And so taking our time, negotiating, having conversations face to face is the best way to move something forward. And that's what the Prime Minister's doing for Canada and Canadians.
Yeah, I hear you making sounds behind me. Go for it.
No, I think in particular, too, as we move towards 2026 and Kuzma, I agree that, I'm sure Dominic LeBlanc and others are doing their level best to push negotiations forward, but we haven't seen a lot of positive indications as to exactly what the result's going to be. Mark Carney even said himself, we're going to negotiate an even better deal, so we're setting expectations even higher when the likelihood remains uncertain, at least. I think on the positive side, in my opinion, we saw the resuscitation of Keystone XL as that potentially being a project that we can move forward, which I think is a good thing to just get Canadian energy moving, especially when a lot of that project has already been completed. I think that's a positive thing. But in looking at the domestic side of these issues, particularly dealing with Donald Trump and energy in particular, what I don't think is helpful is when you see NDP premiers like David Eby invoke Donald Trump as the reason for why we can't get an Alberta pipeline to the West Coast. And, EB invoking Trump is the reason why that can't happen, I think that's not helpful in this current climate.
Listen, we're going to get to that in a sec, because I do want to talk about the expected deals in weeks, one of which has to do with energy. But, you know, the other point that Polyev is making, or takes issue with rather, is that $1 billion cited by the Prime Minister when he was in the Oval Office, this idea that there would be $1 billion over 5 years of investment in the United States if Mark Carney gets the deal Canadian officials expect to get from the United States. Pierre Polyev takes issue with that. Why take issue with it, Cole, when at the end of the day, all he's doing is publicly signaling to Americans, investors, and politicians in Washington that there is a worth of the Canadian relationship?
Yeah, I think there's a few things going on here. Like, one, Pierre Polyev and the Conservatives would like to point out the ever familiar relationship between Mark Carney and Donald Trump, compared to the posturing that we saw during the election and afterwards, and the difference between those two things. In regards to the direct, $1 billion quote in terms of investment, there's that clip in the House of Commons that we saw where Pierre Polyev and Carney are exchanging remarks on that, and Carney says, yes, I was there, because, they clearly know what each other was saying there. But I think Pierre Polyev and the Conservatives want to point towards the fact that, okay, are we going to be investing even more into the United States when the Liberal Party's messaging was about increasing our self-reliance, when every political party talked about eliminating provincial trade barriers so we weren't reliant on the United States? What's the bridge between those things? How do we observe that delta? And what does it tell us about what the Liberal government's priorities are?
Okay, that familiar relationship that Cole's talking about, Susan, is that a challenge for the Prime Minister? Because, as Cole pointed out, it's gone from elbows up to flattering the American president.
Look, as I've said, Donald Trump is a mercurial guy. I think Mark Carney is a tactician, and Pierre Polyev is a slugger. And that's the difference. The other thing, the quote that was great yesterday was the Prime Minister said in the House of Commons, let me introduce you to two words called the private sector. And I think the signal that the Prime Minister was giving in the Oval Office, and you were there, Michael, was that if we get a deal and the Canadian economy grows, there will be investment in Canada, because that's what will happen when Canadian companies grow. But ideally, when Canadian companies grow, they then diversify their businesses. They broaden the scope of what they do. And Canadian companies investing in the US or investing in the UK or whatever is a function of growth. Question period answers don't give a lot of time for actual long economic explanations. I'm sure Mr. Carney, the PhD in economy, could teach Pierre Polyev, the professional politician, one or two things about the economics and how that kind of works from an economic growth perspective. But the Prime Minister has the trust of the country to get it done with Trump. The country did not trust Pierre Polyev to get it done with Trump. The other thing I don't hear any solutions or other paths from Mr. Polyev. Mr. Polyev wants to continue to say, well, they should have picked me instead. Yet he offers nothing constructive in return. So my poker chips, I think, are still with the Prime Minister, the guy who's got national global private sector experience on how to do something to grow and bolster the Canadian economy versus, someone who's just going to yammer across the House.
Okay. I know you want to, but I need to ask one question, though, because the one concrete thing that did come out of Washington was, and this is we're hearing through PMO, the directive to work on steel, aluminum, and energy, with the PMO expecting material progress in the next few weeks. So what will you be watching out for then, Cole?
Sure. Well, to Susan's point earlier, Canadians do trust the Liberal Party and Mark Carney the most to deal with Donald Trump and address these tariffs and these issues that we're talking about for now. That issue, the lack of progress, if we continue to see that from Mark Carney and the Liberal government, combined with the fact that Donald Trump, well, things might have changed after this week, but if the issue continues to be fourth or fifth and not the top of mind for Canadians, but the Liberal Party still trusted the most to deal with Donald Trump, if they fail to get any results and people care less about Trump, that trust will evaporate and they will look elsewhere. And that's where we're starting to see polls shift a little bit. So they trust the Liberal Party for now, but can they maintain that without some big wins on the table in short order?
Okay, Susan, what are you watching out for?
I think the Prime Minister and his cabinet are capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time. So I am watching for the affordability issue and how they continue to handle that. And the reality is, if you have good trade deals and you grow the economy, that does benefit people with jobs and has direct impact on affordability and the key issues. But the government does have to continue to message very, very strongly and remind Canadians of all the things that it's doing. The Prime Minister is leading with his team on these very, very pressing issues because the trade issues on steel and automotive, et cetera, has direct impact on households, so he has to do that. But at the same time, his team needs to continue to communicate on the other issues.
Okay, well, that was quite the trip. Thank you for the opinions of it. We'll speak again. Cole and Susan, thank you.
Thanks, Michael.